A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil Johnson with you, the Monday edition of 2020. And one of those conversations coming over this next hour. Can't guarantee everything that we talk about will be sanitised. There might be some quite open conversation around being in a sexualised world. So just offering a little warning for parents. If there are little ears around, it might be a good opportunity to shield those little ears if you are able. Well, our 21st century modern culture presents young people with many exciting opportunities, but there's also many new challenges. Our special guest today says the challenges include the hypersexualization of young people, the impact of the digital world, and the pressures on home life. Paul Ninnis says a lack of formation in these areas can result in poor decision-making, heartache, and mental illness. But on the contrary, there is a contrast. It means that good formation can lead to wise and successful navigation of our modern world. Paul Ninnis is the co-founder and managing director of Real Talk International. Paul has postgraduate qualifications in sexual health and theology, and he's a sought-after speaker nationally. Paul, I might say a special welcome along to 2020.
It's awesome to be here. Thanks.
Hey, Paul, things don't seem to be getting easier or better for parents or for the young people navigating this world. Some people might like to think, things are on the improve, aren't they? What's your perspective?
Yeah, overall, unfortunately, it's becoming a difficult and challenging time for children and for parents alike as well. I think the onslaught of the digital age is well and truly here, and in many ways, we've missed an opportunity and missed a generation when it comes to teaching them biblical principles before they got saturated with, social media and online, secular ideas around sex, relationships and marriage.
Missing a generation. This is challenging because did we miss the generation of children growing into teenage years, or did we miss the generation of parents who are having those children? Which generation? I mean, I don't think we're pointing fingers. There's no blame here, but things have crept up and accelerated to the point where, wow, this is not easy to contain.
Correct, yeah. And what I mean by that is there was a book written recently called The Anxious Generation, which positioned this quite cleverly and in a way that can help parents. Is a lot of young people are struggling with mental health issues, and the author of that book would point that this correlates very neatly with social media. And so we've got, say, young adults in church who are quite enslaved to pornography and things like that. And what the author of this book said was, we did it to them. And that's not pointing the finger, but it's saying we didn't know that the saturation of the digital age was going to be so confronting, so addictive, and so immersive for a young person and their soul, that it really has taken over the actions, behaviours and relationships of today's young adults.
And interesting for a conversation like this at the very beginning, because sometimes when we're having a conversation, whether it's about pornography or the sexualisation of society, people think, that'll be the Christians pointing a finger and wagging a sort of a moralistic approach.
Yep.
What I suspect is coming through this hour is some encouragement for parents as to how to set our kids up to win a battle for purity. When you are framing a conversation like this, clearly there are some that think, you're a Christian and you're talking about pornography and sexualization, that somehow or other you're being very judgmental. How do you frame it, Paul?
No, look, we talk about human flourishing and happiness. Like the cry of the human heart is to be loved, to be known, to be seen, and to be happy. And when people learn how to control their sexuality and use it as a gift for others and essentially follow the biblical outline for how we're meant to live in relationships, when people follow that, it leads to happiness, flourishing, and just great character. And so there's a lot of people who buy into our message, not because they've heard the gospel, but because they hear the truth of the message. And sadly, what often points people to the truth is that they've experienced the downfall and the negative side of not living that way. And we see it in our audiences all the time. This year we're going to speak to over 30,000 people across 700 speaking sessions in schools. And we see it in the young people's faces, and we see it particularly in young women who are often more sensitive and able to perceive their own emotions and desires. And it's tragic, but it's hope-filled as well.
You know, as a parent myself, and I can reflect on times my wife and I, we've said with the raising of our daughters, we've got to be a commentator on what happens in the world. If we're talking about formation and how parents are equipped, is this one of the things you've got to do? You've got to be a commentator,
Yes.
which means you've got to be able to point out when you're seeing something not right. And it might be a neighbour or it might be someone, in the news headlines.
Yes.
Somehow or other, you've got to be able to run a running commentary on life so that there is a formation that's happening.
Yeah, totally. Look, the everyday teachable moments are just gold. And I encourage parents to not shy away from that. Even if their teenagers are rebellious of the conversation and make like they're not listening, the research is clear. Parents are the biggest influencers. So those conversations in the car as you drive past a billboard, they're beautiful and they're rich. Even if you don't think they're landing, they are, and they're an opportunity. But it starts young, right? Like, again, a lot of parents think of sex education as, oh, well, I'll wait till the teenage years. Like, this starts not just sex education, but moral formation starts young. I had something happen last night with my 4-year-old. Do you mind if I share it?
Absolutely.
Oh, as I was going to bed and we were talking about being away for the weekend, I was just telling him how much I loved him, because I do, and I forget to say that, but I want him to have great worth, and I want him to know how much his dad loves him. And he said something that I thought was silly, but was totally a 4-year-old's interpretation. He said, "But you don't love me when you say no." And I said, "Oh, I don't know about that." And we just talked about a brown snake that I'd seen. And so I said to him, "Look, if our baby, we've got a 1-year-old, if Abigail went to pick up a brown snake, what would you say?" You'd say no. And he's like, "Yeah." And I said, "Would that be loving?" And he said, "Yeah, it would." And so he very quickly grasped the idea that a loving parent or a loving rule can sometimes be a rule that says no. And so there's opportunities like that every day, and sometimes we miss them because life is busy and full on.
You mentioned, driving past that billboard. We might even say that ad comes on TV. It could be to do with not only a sexualised world, but, the gambling issues now that we're also confronted with, all of the different moral challenges that we're facing. Is it a typical thing, do you think? A lot of parents are saying, well, I hope my child didn't see that sign as we drove past. Yes. I hope my kids are not watching and taking in all of that gambling stuff that they're seeing on TV. There's a sort of a wishful thinking. I hope they didn't see that. What's the most telling thing here? The kids did notice, maybe even before you did.
Yeah, totally. Look, unfortunately, the sort of hoping our kids will turn out all right is not going to be very successful. And again, the average parent, and I would include myself in this, probably thinks higher of their children than the reality as far as their exposure to things and also their behaviours. And often if we reflect on our own life, that's a good way to work that out, is because most people who are a bit older, they've got memories themselves of making poor choices when it comes to relationships and intimacy. And so, yeah, I would encourage parents to use those teachable moments and to generally speak to their young people about the topics that are awkward and difficult earlier than they think they need it, because that's probably closer to the reality. And I've got a lot of stats I could lay down that paint that, I want to say grim, but it's not grim. It's just the reality of the world. And Jesus came into a broken world, and there was plenty of communities that were living really poor lives around the time of Paul's letters and whatnot. So it's not unusual.
We've introduced into our conversation this word formation. And really for people who've not been a part of some of the bigger church programs, we don't understand what that word really means. If you're in church life and you recognise, well, if someone has a aspiration to move into a level of mature leadership, even in church life, oftentimes there's a period of formation, and it's not a short period.
Yes.
And this is adults we're talking.
Yep.
So when we're talking about our children here and formation, how does that fit into a process that you think that parents might be interested in?
Yeah. So the process is one of everyday life, but also some specific dedicated time of education. But education's probably not the right word. Maybe the right word is discipleship. It involves leadership and guidance, and it also involves discipline. Disciple and discipline come from the same Latin root, right? So we can't be good disciples without learning the characteristics of endurance and patience and growing training, as Paul would speak about in the scriptures. So formation is all life. Formation is all moments, but it is also specific and guided so that people can not only learn good things, but be mentored and taught and discipled is the right word in those things.
And I imagine that when you've got teenagers growing into adulthood, this is an important element that doesn't happen accidentally. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, of course, we're our role modelling as parents, as men and women. We're hoping that our kids are watching us. These other, social media opportunities, they're a distraction from kids watching mum and dad.
Yes.
I imagine mum and dad are still the most important focal point for mentorship and discipleship here.
Totally.
But it gets watered down, doesn't it, with all of the other distractions?
Correct. Yeah. So again, the research backs this up. Children, the biggest influence on sexuality and relationship topics are the parents and the parents' belief. But it also is what they see in the parents. And so this is the challenge for me and for every parent listening is what are our kids seeing? So even something like our device use. Sometimes tragically when we're speaking to students in schools and we ask them about, what are the things that they don't like about phones, or have they ever experienced a time where they felt someone using a device made them feel disconnected or not loved? And they often talk about their parents using their devices when they want their parents' attention. So it sort of starts at home, but then it gets very specific as we get into those years where our children leave the age of innocence and enter the teenage years. And at that point, the loudest voice becomes the world. It becomes social media. And so teaching our kids to be critical thinkers, but also showing some temperance and creating some restrictions around the amount of media, because it's sometimes just a fight of quantity. It's very hard to win this battle if we keep forming ourselves, and our children are forming themselves with a smorgasbord and a large quantity of secularized ideas.
Hey, Paul, when we talk about the parenting process, oftentimes we'll say, well, what has the Bible got to say? Where do we get wisdom from God in all of this? And, of course, we might come to Proverbs, and there might be lots of stories throughout the Scriptures. What is it comes to mind for you that helps to shape our influence here as parents?
Yeah, look, I regularly lean into Paul in the Scriptures because he wrote to communities that were very secular and very sexualized at times, right? And so there's so much wisdom there. One I've been reflecting on lately is from 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, where he says, "Keep watch, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, do everything in love." And I like this because it's pithy, but it covers a lot of things. There's the keep watch, right? So have an eye out. There's the standing firm in your faith. So as parents, we're often needing to do that. It might be in our school systems. It might be in our family culture. It might even be speaking to our children about their friends or speaking to their friends and standing firm in our faith and being courageous at times when you often don't feel like being courageous. And that could be simply, am I going to talk about that billboard? Am I going to ask my son whether he's seen pornography? Like, that takes courage for a parent that is not equipped in that.
You've got some wonderful role model examples, and thinking of the Old Testament characters, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, his good mates, the sorts of challenges and struggles that they had to navigate to be able to stand strong and not be swept away by the current of the day. When we're teaching our kids about Daniel and the lion's den and praying 3 times a day and all those sorts of things, are these opportunities to connect to real life parenting? Because sometimes it's just a Bible story, but bringing that connection has to be important.
It does. And I think one of the connections that often is missed and is really important in today's generation, say Gen Z, is the idea around training and diligence. Okay. So, patience and growth and endurance. It doesn't sort of drop down from the heaven. It happens through challenge, right? Through suffering at times. And so in just about every biblical story, you can point to this. I love speaking about the story of David, which often gets pitched in children's books as one of faith and almost luck. He flung it in, it was just God, but he'd been out in the fields using his slingshot daily, and it says he'd been killing bears and lions to protect his flock. He'd been doing his daily duty and prayerfully developed this heart of God that when called upon in the moment of battle, he was equipped. And so so many of these biblical stories point to equipping, and yet today's culture, it's the sort of microwave generation. Like, let's face it, we don't even need to choose a song these days. We can go on and it'll predict the song that we want to choose, right? And so I think that's one of the biggest things, is recognizing that the spirit of the age is one of instant gratification. But really, the spirit of the gospel was one of faithfulness. Knowing the characteristics of humanity needs training, diligence, repetition, often,
I imagine too, while we're talking parents here and raising children in a sexualised world, how that formation comes. Let's just reflect here. I don't want to make grandparents feel like they're somehow rather not important here, because sometimes grandparents are concerned about their grandchildren, whereas their own children might be missing the mark. And I don't say that disrespectfully, because they're the parents, but somehow or other grandparents have a big role to play too, don't they?
Yeah, totally. I want to really encourage grandparents. Like, sometimes older people are just dying off, and they're not. They've got so much wisdom, and again, our culture doesn't hold up with great regard the wisdom that previous cultures have. But that's an opportunity to be in the space of young people. And wisdom is something that it's not taught, right? It's something that sort of rubs off. It's a bit like cultural change. It happens through presence and time. And so I would encourage older people, the grandparents, to get out there with their grandchildren and take them fishing. Right? Teach them something like how to mow the lawn, but something that has a deliberate nature and time, and then there's those opportunities just to share the love of Jesus or the love of God in their lives in those everyday moments. They're rich. They're beautiful.
I want to ask you something that might be a harder question. How do you know, as a parent, if you are being successful in this formation process? Because, we might be looking for milestones. We got past this point or that point, or now we're heading towards another very vulnerable place. Could be the ages of our kids.
Yes.
Is there any way you can sort of monitor how successful you're being, helping your child to have this formation that enables them to be able to resist the pressures of this world?
Yeah, look, I think it's a tough one, right? Because as parents, we're often critical. And if you're listening to this, you're probably an above average parent who cares greatly about your children. So I would say be cautious, because through in the teenage years, there's a lot of kids that will go off track, right? There's a lot of young people who will make choices that makes you shake your head as a mature adult. They are baby adults. Like, they are just learning how to do this thing called life. And so we need to recognize that they're going to make mistakes. My first marker would be always sow into the relationship. And really that's about showing them the heart of God, right? That you love them, and trying to build up their self-worth. Because if a young person, half the battle really to make positive choices is to recognize their dignity and worth. And so that we always want to come back to that. Does my child feel loved? Does my child know they are great and precious and made in God's image? And really after that, there's a lot you can do, but don't judge yourself too harshly. Like, the bottom line is, most young people go through tough years, particularly those teenage years where you might feel like you're failing, but you just need to hang in there, keep loving them and keep doing your best.
How much reward for your hard work is there? Because, our kids are going to hit 18. They're off doing their own thing. They're not listening anymore. Maybe they're not listening from about age 13. But reward for your hard work, that your son or your daughter grows up to be able to be open about these sorts of things, to be able to navigate their way forward in the hypersexualization of society. But it's more than that too. It's because of this sexualization. There's all sorts of dimensions about how a young man treats young women.
Yes.
And how young women might treat men. The reward might be that your children grow up understanding, how and why these things work.
Yeah, totally. Look, and my children are young, so I'm not speaking from experience. You might have seen more and have more wisdom on this, Neil. But I think like our hope is that our children are safe, healthy. If you're a Christian, that they know the Lord, we live in I suppose, enemy territory in some ways. We live in a toxic environment, and so we do the best we can, and at some point we have to let go and let God. But at the same time, be a constant, steadfast rock in their lives where they know they can come to us, and that we will be the father in the prodigal son story, right? The father that welcomes them back with mercy and loves them.
Paul, let me ask you about some of the statistics, and sometimes we don't like to get caught up in all sorts of number crunching, but the statistics actually paint a pretty grim picture of where our young people are at the moment.
Yeah, they can wake us all up, wake society up, and wake parents up, and that's not a bad thing, right? We want to know the reality of the world, and we want to know what our young people are experiencing. You know, I was confronted by this stat just last week. The Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation gets over 50,000 reports every year. And to give you an idea of how sexual abuse material and children being exploited is commonplace, you know, Facebook every day removes over 50,000 images every day from Facebook from people trying to post things. And so that's child sex abuse material. So these stats wake up me even, right? They make me realise we think sometimes of the real world having predators. You know, we don't want our kids to walk down to the shops, but predators gather in places where children gather, and that means they're gathering on social media and online, because that's where the in is. That's where the open door is to so many young people's lives.
For a lot of us, we might think some of this sounds like it used to be rare. That's not what I'm hearing from you. Is there some sort of a critical mass of child exploitation people who are now just fishing in the ocean and looking for some child to exploit? Is this the world we're living in today?
Yeah, look, totally. Unfortunately, online, there is a lot of people doing a lot of things. Now, again, we got to be careful not to be fearful, right? We don't want to live in fear. The bottom line is that there's a lot of good things to come off the internet, and we were just talking about some in the break, right? Where we can learn new things. Even as parents, it can help guide us on these topics. But we don't want to be naive either. There are opportunities for young people to be exposed, and it's a huge cliff face. And that's the problem with, say, something like pornography. You know, we have most young people on average being exposed to porn somewhere between the ages of 8 and 13. And so it's a common thing that happens under the eyes, under the roof of good parents, because they think of evil, they think of bad stuff and bad people being outside, when if you've got access to the internet, you've got the world at your fingertips. You've got the world's biggest porn collection. If they have a device in their room. Yeah.
Let me ask you about parents, because there's a saying, and what do you make of this saying that says, don't expect your kids to walk in sexual purity if you are not? There's a challenge there for parents, isn't there?
Totally, yeah. There's a big challenge, and that's hard. I work a lot with men, and there's a lot of Christian men. Some of the stats on that would suggest the majority in Christian churches who struggle with pornography, for instance, and that again wakes a lot of people up. And I don't speak with condemnation to those men. I speak with a tenderness and go, hey, you in your life need discipleship and guidance and somewhere to go to get supported on that journey. And it also points to the fact that this often isn't a choice. It's a neurophysiological thing in someone's life, such as their habit of using pornography. It's less a moral decision-making choice. Now both are there, and so we as parents need to try to walk in the light, be in the light and walk with purity, but also not let that stop you from having conversations with your young people and to try to still be immersed in these important topics.
Let me ask you about the concept of shame, because it seems to be, and let's just take that at face value, that there are perhaps even a majority of men who would say, I'm a Christian, and yet I've struggled with these sorts of issues around pornography. So let's just take that as a given. But then it comes to your children, and you feel ashamed of your own actions.
Yes.
Ought that to be something that stops you from actually confronting or being a part of the conversation with your own children because somehow or other you missed it, and you can't afford to drop the ball here, can you?
Yeah, look, totally. It can be so disempowering, shame, and it's one of those difficult things. But again, I mentioned in the first segment the prodigal son story, and the idea that Jesus told this story when speaking about mercy, and so we need to go to God and do the best we can to receive God's love and forgiveness, so that we're not living out of that. I sort of call it the double-edged sword. So often we get taken out with our stuff up, our sins, our mistakes. And then we get taken out again on the way back with our regrets and our shame. And so we need to not let that hold us down. It is healthy to experience a level of guilt and shame, but this toxic shame that can build up particularly in Christians, is something that is not of God if it keeps us from being the sort of people we need to be in the world. And that means, speaking to our young people and not being afraid to have these conversations.
When we talk about pornography, this might just be the starting point. And no doubt in our conversation today, this is where those conversations need to revolve with your children, even from young years. Mm-hmm. But the outcomes of what happens with the pornography, the breakdown of relationships,
yes.
The disrespect that you might have for the opposite sex.
Yes.
Those sorts of things.
Consent.
That every dimension that can actually go bad obviously starts back at this starting point about what you're allowing through that eye gate.
Yeah, look, I believe it's a centre point issue in society. I think it's a social justice issue that the world is missing, because these are young, innocent children, and regardless of your worldly beliefs, most people believe young children should be protected. And, the hypersexual generation we live in and the exposure to porn means that at a very early age, people are robbed of innocence. And as you said, the effects can be long-lasting, connections to marriage breakdown, very strong connections. In fact, I'd say in the research, the secular research, just you can't argue against it. Connections between violence against women and porn is just off the charts. There's like over 50 different institutions and academic papers that have found the same thing. So it's a centre point issue, and I think it is a big part of the struggle when it comes to healthy sexuality, God's plan for sex, as opposed to the enemy that wants to destroy marriages, families, and lives.
So that bad formation is going to reap all sorts of dreadful things in your child's life if you don't take responsibility. Mm-hmm. If you do take responsibility, and all those relationship issues that can flourish, and your attitudes to humanity can flourish, that's going to put your child on a winning trajectory.
Yeah, totally. And that's where sometimes these negative things, and let's say a parent has discovered that their young person has seen something that has really shaken them up, there is an opportunity then, because once it's brought into the light, you can then speak about the goods of human flourishing, right? That we're meant to give of ourselves, right? That we're meant to have a lifelong covenant relationship that is life-giving, that brings life into the world, children into the world, and that this mimics and models the way God loves, right? That this is a great mystery that points us to God. There's so much beauty, and again, it's hard to say that. Some of the listeners will come from marriages and families that are broken pictures, and we all experience brokenness. But when experienced the way it's meant to be, it is one of the real lights on the hill. A family, a loving couple, like love and togetherness and flourishing and family in itself are beautiful pictures. And so we need to point people to how our sexuality is meant to lead us closer to others and closer to God.
We're all on a learning curve, aren't we? And some are a little bit more along the curve than others. But somehow or other, not letting your own ignorance or naivety to be the thing that holds you back, because your kids, your most valuable asset, they're depending on you getting something right here.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, as Christians, we say, well, of course, we've got a biblical foundation to build on. Yes. And we can keep coming back to that. We can keep being reminded of that. Yes. If you're a secular person, you have no faith. It's a little bit like you just think, oh, well, you just got to adjust to this. But adjusting, what are your thoughts here? I suspect adjusting's not going to be the answer, because the outcomes of that are going to be pretty dreadful.
Yeah, you need a firm foundation, right? You need the pillars, and again, I mentioned earlier, Paul, like, he spoke so often about sexuality, and some people are a bit shaken up by that. But I'm like, if you want to speak about communities and families, you need to speak into this topic. It is, you can't just find your way. That being said, our bodies are made in God's image, and so within them is written the blueprint of truth. And I've had wonderful experiences with people who don't know the Lord, but through their encounters with their body and their sexuality have come to see truth through that. And if we're made in God's image, we could understand that. But it's often hidden between by layers of shame, layers of guilt, but also just layers of abuse and misuse.
So in some sense here, if you are a person who doesn't have a great lot of faith, you can actually discover that those things that people of faith have,
Yes.
the truth of Scripture, you
Yes.
can actually apply a little bit of scientific knowledge to
Yes.
just how your body works to recognize
Yes.
that this is the way God has made us.
Yes.
Now, if we've got the way God has made us in mind,
Yes.
this is where some of the good programs that you've got going with Real Talk Australia, you call them blueprints for parents to be able to use and for people to be able to even apply in their own lives. A blueprint is a very good word.
Yeah, I like it. I just threw it out there. But it's, again, if we think of the Imago Dei, the idea that we're created in God's image, this doesn't stop like a picture on the wall, right? It's more like an icon or something you can see through. So if you think of masculinity and femininity, for instance, our bodies clearly show us that we're created for another. Like that is rich and true and beautiful, right? And so when we realize that we can't do life alone, right? That we're actually created in partnership, there's so much richness in that. And why are people so fascinated with love? All the songs on radio, why are marriage shows such a big thing? You know, it's because deep within us, we have a yearning for love. We have a learning to be known. And there's something in that draws us towards the truth, you know?
A lot of the work you do, you mentioned, is with men. So while we're talking children here, young people, both young men and young women are growing through these formation times, wanting to get things right. But you do a lot of work with men and sexual integrity. And you've got this program coming out very shortly called the Stout-Hearted Program. When you're working with men, I mean, how open are men to understanding the sorts of things you're bringing in a seminar setting?
Yeah, look, initially men are silent, right? Because we've had generational passing on of that you don't talk about this, it's taboo. You know, when you bring things out in the light, it's amazing what it does for others. And I share openly my struggles and my story, and that usually paves the way for other men to either grab me after the seminar or in small groups or in a discipleship program such as Stout-Hearted to actually take a journey and go, well, I've never said this before, but this is my struggle. And I've never said this before, but I had a really bad upbringing when it came to fatherhood, for instance, or whatever it may be. And then once you open it up, then the light can come in, and then so much happens in a person's heart and in their mind.
Mostly it's somehow or other, I imagine, comes down to if I had an upbringing and my dad was open with me, then I might be more open to having those open conversations with my own children.
Yes.
Do you bring into the conversation, in some ways, correcting what was wrong with your own upbringing so that you can get things right for the next generation? Is this about rescuing a whole generation just by talking about our own attitudes, whether we're men or women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's about being wise, but that you know, we live life forwards, but we understand it backwards, right? So it's very hard for someone to recognize where they want to go if they don't first analyze their own history or their own experience. And so one of the first questions I ask people is what was your introduction to this topic? And sadly, there's, a lot of comedy comes out because people's introduction to this topic were often fumbling either in their own experiences or their parents doing a really bad job. And that's not their parents' fault, right? Particularly those coming from older generations where the men were taken out with war and basically often had traumatic lives. We couldn't have expected much. But in today's culture, it's so confronting for a person that we need to speak about it. And this is one of the fruits of the internet and Vision Radio, that there's so many resources we can tap into that help us with those conversations. But yeah, you need to understand yourself. And part of that self-reflection, which people are poor at generally these days I find it hard to stop.
Amazing when you start to reflect on biblical times or historical times, men going off to war, not coming home, children faced with being raised by a single parent. No difference, I imagine, here. If you are the single parent, you've got to take maybe even a little extra responsibility. I imagine, though, if you are a two-parent family, mum and dad, that you need to be on the same page when you're helping to develop this formation for your children.
Yeah, look, it certainly helps, but as you said, no situation is perfect, so that let's not let that stop us having these conversations. And there's a lot of single parents out there, or maybe you're in a relationship where you're not on the same page, and I would encourage you to still do the best job you can. But yeah, search for solid father figures, search for role models, search for mother figures, open environments. And again, church communities are great for this. Often there's a youth leader that a young person will listen to much better than they might listen to one of their parents. And search for those opportunities where you just sow in time and relationship, because out of that, the fruit will be connection and the fruit will be conversations. And that's when you can't be afraid to step into those conversations.
If we're talking takeaways, and I know that there'll be listeners who are thinking, give me a little practical 3-step program, because if I'm going to make an adjustment now, I need to be able to include these priorities in there. Is there a way we can talk about 3 easy steps to taking control as a parent and doing this formation with your children, something that you can do as something that's ongoing, something that's going to bear fruit in the long term? Where might we start with something just around practical issues here, Paul?
Yeah, great. And you've thrown that at me, so I haven't prepared something. But the first thing I'd say is the biggest thing that parents say to us at our parent nights is the digital world scares them, right? Their kids have phones. They didn't grow up in this world. They don't know how to deal with that. So I would say, firstly, I would say search for a video that we have online called the eSafety Onion, Real Talk, the eSafety Onion. It's a free video, and there's also a resource that comes with it that's free as well. So check that out for the digital questions. Other than that, I would say that the steps are, firstly, remember that a person's worth and value is going to be that foundation that they make decisions from. So we can talk about all sorts of topics, but when we speak to young people, we say, know your worth and value. If you get that, it's so much easier to make good decisions, because you want to protect that which is precious. But if you don't think you're precious, you're not going to want to protect it. So that would be the starting point of parenting is really connection. Jesus so often pointed us back to the heart of the issue. Blessed are the pure heart, for they shall see God, or any man that looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. This reminds us that we want to get to the heart. And so having a heart for our children, so Malachi 4, turn our hearts towards our children. And every parent wants to do that. We do it, but we get busy too, right? We can go a whole week without realizing I haven't had an eye-to-eye conversation with my child. Like, how does that happen? But it does. So when we soften our hearts and remind ourselves of that great responsibility, that great duty, but the great privilege of forming a young person, that really transforms our direction. So concentrate on worth, have a heart for your children. And then the third one I'll throw out there is talk about the real issues. So this is things like pornography. This is how you interact with digital devices, and that tech addiction's a real thing and clearly correlates with poor mental health outcomes.
And I know you like to say being the first voice that your kids hear about all of these issues, so whether it's gender identity or whether it's sex, pornography, God's design for marriage. Yep. This is an important area for parents to say, let me be the first before somebody else jumps in there.
Yeah, and sadly what happens is we're often not, right? So if that happens, just go run with it and see it as an opportunity, right? The ball got rolling without me. So someone said something to and this is usually how things happen, right? A parent will come to us and say, you wouldn't believe what my child said to me, and I've got many stories in my head, but for clean G-rated radio, I won't say them right now. But yeah, totally. So, for instance, a classic throwaway line that shocks people is I say you need to talk to your children about pornography before they have access to the internet. Now, that's usually preschool age. Now, you don't have to use the word pornography, but you talk to them about the fact that they may or will see things online that are upsetting and distressing. And it might include multiple categories, things that shock you or scare you. gore. But also you may see, for instance, people's private parts, the parts we cover with our swimwear, and talk to them about what they should do when that happens, so that a child, and the classic story is, I hear the story at the end, right? The person who's got a porn addiction or dysfunctional sexuality who says, yeah, I started to look at porn at age 9 or 10 because I saw this stuff and it got a grip on me, right? So let's get in before that. And that doesn't mean you need to be explicit. That doesn't mean you need to scandalise your children or lead them, but just gentle conversations saying, hey, if you see something, you can tell me about it and you won't be in trouble and I love you. And model that and use negative things that happen from cyberbullying or friendship dramas or first crushes as opportunities for walking with them.
And Paul, when the horse has bolted and your kids are already secretly they're into pornography, you know that their values are being adjusted and shaped by other issues outside of your home. Mm-hmm. You haven't had the strong enough culture in your home to resist the overwhelming tidal wave of culture that's coming upon your children. Mm-hmm. Is there hope here? We could
Yes.
get depressed about, the horse has bolted and my kids are off doing stuff that I wouldn't even like to just
Yes.
try and describe to you. But
Yes.
Where are those parents at?
Yeah, look, again, I just want to be encouraging and give you the reality is a lot of Christian parents are shocked when they find out the numbers, right? The numbers of porn use, even in their own family. And I've got a memory of a lady with 7 sons coming to me one day saying, I would never have listened to your talk, but now that all my sons are adults, I've discovered that they all use pornography and I had no idea. Right. And so I just want to firstly say that the reality of the stats are that many of our children will not only see porn, but perhaps will develop habits in this direction. So I want to encourage you that there is hope. And again, putting our head in the sand and ignoring it is just not helpful. So we need to understand the reality. We understand that this is very much a neurophysiological thing that is really hard. Most people grew up in generations where they weren't exposed to porn. So if we think of someone 150 years ago, I think if I get this stat right, in the 1960s, a man had about 20% chance of seeing porn. Okay. Like now it's close to 100% saturation by adulthood. So it's different. It's harder. Even just like a grandparent, for instance, it's so much harder than today's young people because of the digital media and just the onslaught of all sorts of messages. So I just want to encourage the open conversations, pointing back to those biblical truths of worth, value, and dignity, the sanctity of marriage, and that your sexuality is meant to be a gift, that it's really hard to control, right? It's potent and it's powerful, and we all understand that, but that because of that power, it's such a beautiful gift that can be laid down for another and bring about great joy, pleasure, life,
Well, Paul, I love your heart and I love the way you so beautifully communicate these things. And let's just make a plan to get back together and have you on again on some other dimensions, because this is so deep and there's so many dimensions. But today, to be able to talk about what we do as parents as we recognise that our children are a part of a hypersexualised culture and how we help them to navigate that course. We did mention there's a whole lot of resources that are available from realtalkaustralia.com. You can also find clips on YouTube and free resources when you check out that website, realtalkaustralia.com. Paul mentioned he's doing some things with men in the new year. Men of Sexual Integrity and a new stout-hearted program that they're introducing. There's all sorts of good resources. I'll point listeners to realtalkaustralia.com. Paul Ninnis is co-founder and managing director of Real Talk International. Hey, Paul, thank you so much for coming and sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
It's been wonderful to be here.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.